You argue that AI, while democratizing access to knowledge, is eroding the systems we use to build true human expertise. What does that look like that in terms of loss for professional scientists and society as a whole?
We are displacing the experts of the future with repetitive AI, and that really scares me.
When you look at how fast technology is advancing, what future do you think we should be preparing for? And who do we trust to lead us there?
The true leaders will be those people who come out and produce good, targeted, focused legislation, put money behind enforcement, international cooperation around it. Let's mitigate the harms and kind of allow the technology side to benefit humanity, as I'm sure it will.
Welcome to another episode of Tech Transformed, where we explore emerging technologies reshaping our world and explore how tech is shaping the future of business. I'm your host, Trisha Pillay, producer and editor here at EM360 Tech, and today we are focusing on one of the most important conversations in AI, how the tools meant to democratize knowledge may be quietly dismantling the very foundation of human expertise. Joining me is Nigel Cannings, a leading voice in AI innovation and the author of Displacement Dilemma, Navigating Expertise in an AI-Driven World. Nigel, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, Trisha, it's fantastic to be here. Thanks very much for having me on the podcast today.
So before getting into it, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You're a lawyer. What led you to focus on AI?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of unusual in that regard. There's not too many lawyers who find themselves founding and building and then selling AI companies. But I was in the unusual position that my dad brought the first ever PCs to Europe back in 1978. So when I was 10 years old, the first Commodore PETs, the first Apples, he was selling these in Europe. So I learned how to program at the age of 10 in BASIC or even assembler back in those days. And so I was kind of always around computers my whole life. I had some ideas around natural language processing. As a lawyer, I'd seen, we could really do with some automation and tools there to really help understand what was going on. But ended up working in financial compliance, which was an area where I saw that listening into trader telephone calls, reading emails and chat and so on would help us prevent maybe the next financial crisis. So this is 2008. Would it prevent the next financial crisis? And that kind of love of language and NLP led me into AI. So I pioneered a lot of work in speech recognition on GPUs back in 2014, 2015, the first company to ever use GPUs for speech processing. Then moving into transformer networks in kind of 2018, 2019, building explainable networks then. And so I've just had a kind of background in tech. I've loved tech my whole life. And so basically bought GPU cards because they look like fun and kind of ended up doing AI for a living. So that's pretty much how I find myself here.
Wow, that's quite an interesting career path. Now, let's start with the main idea behind your book, The Displacement Dilemma. You argue that AI, while democratizing access to knowledge, is eroding the systems we use to build true human expertise. What does that look like that in terms of loss for professional scientists and society as a whole?
It's a really interesting problem, actually, because we've been seeing it anyway for a few years in kind of call centers and places like that, where we were beginning to replace agents with IVR systems. And what people began to notice was that when really hard problems turned up, there weren't the people there to deal with it, because there was no one had been trained on the really easy stuff to kind of get to that level of dealing with hard problems. And it got me thinking about what was going to happen in AI. When I wrote the book, it was very much what was going to happen. It was kind of a year or so ago that I wrote the first edition of the book. The book was really about trying to make people stop and think, we're going to need experts in 20 years' time. And replacing all of those entry-level jobs today will mean that in 20 years' time, there's no experts left. How do we deal with that? And how do professions which rely upon that kind of that build-up of expertise to a point also cope with the fact that they may not need as many experts in the future. They're still going to need them, but the law, for example, are we really going to need as many lawyers as we've got today? Will we need as many doctors or, and so then I'll start looking at how we reskill people and that type of stuff. But for me, that is the core of the displacement dilemma. We are displacing the experts of the future with repetitive AI. And that really scares me.
So just looking at the term AI horizon, we're seeing a rise in deepfakes, synthetic data, and AI's role in law and policy. What do you see as the biggest threats and opportunities in the immediate wave of AI transformation? You did touch on it now, but let's look at it deeper. Do you think the way we consume information now is changing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we all see it, and it's in so many different ways as well, because the attention span of most people for absorbing information has got significantly shorter. And that is, that's not, people say, oh, it's just Gen Z. It's not. It's actually everyone is now absorbing news in a much more focused way, a much more algorithmic way as well. So that the information that's placed before us has normally been pre-selected by an algorithm which has learned very much what our preferences and tastes are and what we're likely to focus on. So, and that's AI in action behind that. That's machine learning, but that's still a branch of AI which sits behind that. Then you've got other branches of AI, of generative AI, with things like, generative image technology, generative voice technology, generative video technology, which leads to the rise of misinformation, potentially. It's a great automation tool on the one side. I can create a deepfake Nigel and go out and produce a 2-minute clip for video, which looks virtually indistinguishable from me. And I tried it a little while ago to see whether any followers of mine on social media could tell the difference. And there was a very subtle thing in the voice. We haven't really quite got voice cloning right yet, but the video cloning was incredible. So yeah, we all know that the information that's hitting us is probably manipulated in some way. Not everything we see, but you can pretty much guarantee that in any one day, something that we see will have been AI generated and is probably misinformation in some way, shape or form. So we're consuming things in a much more rapid way. We've got algorithms which are forcing things in front of us. If we're attracted to deepfake information, because often it's used there for confirmation bias, then we're going to see more of it because we're going to be spending more time seeing it. So we're seeing this rapidly evolving kind of spiral, really, of people being sucked towards misinformation through the use of deepfakes. And how we challenge that is really something which is very difficult to get to the bottom of. There are potential strategies, but it's not easy.
I know for myself included that when I look for stuff on Google, I look at the AI overview. Before, I used to go down the searches and stuff, but I just want high level information to answer that question. So it's actually quite a scary thought of how we consume information. And you rightly so said it quite well. Now let's move into the more technical aspects of things. Longer term, we hear a lot more about technical concepts, things like binary accelerated LLMs, encryption. Can you break that down for our listeners? What's the bigger picture here?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting things going on at the moment. And one of the things that we're seeing is a massive rise in the number of data centers that are being built. There's a real focus now on the energy consumption and everyone is rushing out to build new data centers. And the reason they're doing it is because modern AI systems rely on very large GPU cards, which have a very large memory capability. And that's all because this current wave of generative AI relies on something called matrix multiplication, something which many of your listeners will be familiar with. But effectively what it means is the longer the input to a large language model, rather than the memory requirement increasing in a linear fashion, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it increases in a quadratic fashion. So for every new piece of information, the amount of memory that is required is quadratic. And the reason why GPU cards are used for that is they're really, really good at matrix multiplication. This is the underlying mathematics that sit behind every single large language model we see today. And because of that, people are saying, well, in the future, if we're going to be consuming 100 times more AI, we're going to need accelerators that go with that. So we're going to need more and more GPU cards. We're going to need more and more energy. We're going to need nuclear power stations by data centers. But that's only because of this current wave of technology. And let's bear in mind that the underlying mathematics that underpin Gen AI were only invented in 2017. I mean, we're only in 2025 now. So, it's less than 8 years since we invented this. And what we're seeing is a step change in how people look at the underlying mathematics of it. And one of those is one of the things you touched on there, which is something called the 1-bit LLM. And what it relies on is it's really kind of a mathematical quirk, really, that if you take a large language model and all of the parameters in it and reduce it to literally zeros and ones, so rather than a big matrix zeros and ones, you can use binary multiplication rather than matrix multiplication. Now, binary multiplication is literally adding up the ones and zeros. So it's a really odd quirk about working in binary. But what that means is the practical effect of that is that when we add new information into a large language model, when we ask it a question, the memory size goes back. Rather than being quadratic and going up like that, it's linear again. So actually the amount of power that's required to answer the same question drops dramatically. So I think we're going to see a rise in binary accelerators. And you also touched upon encryption as well, because one of the other problems that we've got is we know that the modern internet is a data leakage nightmare. So, all of us are sacrificing privacy all the time, but it's part of the kind of social compact that we have. We get free email, but it means that Google can then use some of that email to advertise against. We trust them not to do anything with it, but it's insecure. But there's a whole bunch of things that we want to use AI for, which are really, really sensitive. So say medical information. So, I'd like to be able to use AI to, rather than go to see a doctor, maybe have to wait 6 months to go and see a doctor. I'd like to use AI to help with diagnosis and actually do at-home tests and that type of stuff. But because of the way AI works, in order for the AI doctor to understand what's going on, they have to process it in a decrypted way. So at some point, my super sensitive medical information is available in clear, potentially to someone hacking a GPU card. So what we're seeing is a rise in techniques which effectively protects that data end to end. So one is called homomorphic encryption, which is a way of performing calculations on fully encrypted data. So basically it remains encrypted all the way through. You perform the operations on that and get an answer. But that's massively, massively kind of data and power intensive. So I was just talking about the problem with big data centers. You make it 100 times worse with homomorphic encryption. But we're also seeing the rise of so-called enclaves. So effectively like a nuclear bunker for data. So you can kind of push it through a flap. All of the processing takes place in that bunker. That bunker can't be seen from the outside. And then someone pushes the answer back out through the flap on the other side. And I think one of the things that's really important about the next wave of AI is that we think security first. Because regulation is pushing us in that direction. We're seeing European regulation and perhaps US regulation looking for more privacy there. And I think we need technical solutions to do it. And so those are two of the things we're seeing coming in specifically in the Gen AI world.
Now, when we look at all the knowledge these models hold, why haven't they made any new scientific discoveries? Despite they have this vast memorization, they don't seem to connect the dots the way even moderately intelligent humans can. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's you hit on the point there that it's more about the memorization, and we have to be really careful about how we talk about large language models, because there's a lot of different theories about whether do they truly memorize things, do they just take an abstraction of things, and in fact, a court in the US recently ruled that effectively they don't memorize, that they learn in the same way that humans do by kind of abstracting knowledge away. And that was a really big blow actually to people who were making copyright claims against the big companies like Anthropic and OpenAI. But ultimately they are prediction machines. I mean, that's what we have to get at. They seem super intelligent. I get really annoyed with AI because I spend a lot of my life talking to AI in one way, shape or form. And it acts like an idiot sometimes. It's like, for goodness sake, I'm sure I told you that, and it really annoys me. And you forget that it's not human. You treat it because it seems so intelligent. But actually all it's doing is it's really highly advanced pattern matching and really highly advanced kind of data sifting and pattern matching, because ultimately these networks started off just as a prediction machine. Literally the very first of these networks tried to predict what the next best word should be. They did it looking at the context of a whole sentence, but it was literally, the cat sat on the next thing's going to be Matt, probably in the context of what I'm looking at. And so they started off as prediction machines, and then we turned them into these by kind of reinforcement learning and training into what looked like these super intelligent things, but they're not. They're a kind of fabulous message store and and for me, they are the backbone to the next layer of artificial general intelligence.
Why do you think all the big labs have ended up building the same kind of model? It's like the competition of who can generate the most information, or there's so many, how do I say it? Like ChatGPT models. There's, like I mentioned earlier before, DeepSeek. So transformer-based LLMs focused on mimic thinking. Is it because nothing else is working, or are we stuck in a sort of intellectual echo chamber where everyone's following the same trail without exploring different parts?
I think there's two answers to that, really. I mean, the simple one is it's where the money's at. So, it's unquestionably people can see the benefits of generative AI, and there are a lot of naysayers out there, but there are people who don't like what it can do. But frankly, for most people, it has an effect which makes their lives simpler and easier. It could be helping drafting emails. It could be helping pull together a script for a podcast. Say, you couldn't do it without the human, but you can use it to help accelerate your thinking. I use it as a kind of creative buddy to help me, with ideation and that type of stuff. It doesn't write stuff for me, but it does kind of gets me to where I need to go. So I think it's an incredible tool that we can all use there. And so that's where the money's gone, because it actually really works. However, what we don't see bubbling under the surface is all the other things which are going on. I think, if you kind of do horizon scanning and you look around the place, you actually see there's a whole bunch of people working on the next generation of what AI could look like. And, and people have been working for a very long time on trying to mimic biological mechanisms. So actually looking more like the human brain. So people using spiking neural networks, which actually effectively mimic the way the ear works. It's, the ear, funnily enough, is a neural network, and that how we hear is actually a biological neural network. So people are looking at simple ways of mimicking that. So there's a whole bunch of work going on. Quantum, I mean, crikey, it's, quantum is going to change the world. And we've got to the point now where room temperature quantum actually looks like it's feasible. I mean, for the first time, there was something a few weeks ago. And what that's going to do is, it's not going to, we're not all going to have a quantum computer at home, but what it is going to do is help us solve really hard problems that have been very difficult to solve before. And it will unlock a lot of AI work. I've been doing work with companies on quantum AI.
That's so true. I think the way we're progressing so quickly is actually scary at times. But when you look at how fast technology is advancing, what future do you think we should be preparing for? And who do we trust to lead us there?
Oh, no one. It's a simple answer. It's really difficult, because what we've seen is we've seen people try with the technology-led approach. We've seen people try with a regulation-first approach. So, we see across the world at the moment, different jurisdictions are grappling with the difficulties of this new technology. They're grappling with copyright issues. They're grappling with data protection issues. They're grappling with citizen monitoring issues. And the EU have tried tried really hard to codify this, and it now looks like it's all going to get thrown out because it's almost impossible for anyone practically to comply with that. So it would be lovely to think that we would have a kind of, like a CERN in Switzerland, sitting there doing great things for the world, where international scientists came together and did great things for the world's benefit. We will have areas of that. Undoubtedly, there will be people who will be producing AI for the benefit of humanity, like Alan AI and people like that. But for the most part, we're going to see it being led by the major tech companies. And do I trust them to take us into the future? I think actually technologically, yes, I do trust them, because I think that in a sense our interests and their interests align, because they want to make more money out of us, but actually we want to exploit the tools that they're generating. So I think we will. Do I think the politicians can take us there? No, I don't, because I just don't think they really understand the technology and the power of what it can do. I think that they get distracted by some of the pseudo dangers of it and don't necessarily fully understand the advantages. So I'm kind of at the market end of this, where we have to say we may just have to let the market take us through with light touch regulation, and let's focus on the real harms. Let's focus on kind of child sexual exploitation material. Let's CSAM stuff is needs to be found and stamped out. Let's think about things like that. Let's think about the issues of deepfake imagery, and the profound effects that some of this thing can have on people. Revenge porn, things like this. We have to, let's look at the real harms that can be caused.
Nigel, before we wrap up, is there any last thoughts you would like to leave with our audience? Anything about debt expertise?
Absolutely. I'm kind of fascinated by the change that we're seeing. And so I first started writing my book on this over a year ago. And even in that time, it's gone from being something theoretical to being something quite practical. We've seen a massive drop in the number of graduate jobs which are available. And that for me was one of the biggest indicators that this is not just affecting people, in the bits of society that you would expect it to. You might say, well, we won't have as many call center operatives because we've got AI. Okay, that could be true. But who was going to predict a kind of 24% drop in graduate jobs caused by, there will be some economic factors, but mainly because a lot of work is being moved to AI. So it's happening. And, when I first posited this statement, people said to me, oh, don't be so stupid. It won't happen quickly. Or, we always pick up the slack. It's something called Javon's paradox. The idea that, when things become more efficient, we actually start using more of it rather than less of it. Well, that hasn't happened. It's gone the other way. So I'm really interested to talk to people who've been affected by the displacement dilemma, people who are losing their jobs, people who think they're going to lose their jobs, people who can see the erosion of expertise and skills, and people who can't even get a job. Because I think that, I'm ready for the second edition of the displacement dilemma, because I think it's moved so quickly. So, a warning to everyone out there that when you're looking for your next job, make sure it's something where we're always going to need a human. There's going to be a bunch of jobs where we always need a human. Something like this, become a podcast host, because we're never going to replace humans with AI for this sort of stuff. So, that's where I'd leave it. So Trisha, thanks ever so much for having me on today. It's been really, really interesting.
Nigel, thanks so much for joining us. I think this chat reminds us that with AI, it's not just about what we create, but also what we're at risk of losing. The death of expertise is real, and staying ahead means thinking critically and looking beyond our lens. To our listeners, thanks for listening to Tech Transformed. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Follow us at EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn, and visit our website. You'll see it on our screen now for more expert insights. Until next time, stay curious and stay ahead of the trends.